Imagine a place you go maybe every day after work. It's like stepping into a gym, a spa, a really bustling social club, maybe a space for business meetings, a library, even a place to grab something to eat,
Hmm.
all incredibly rolled into one massive
Yeah.
building.
Sounds pretty amazing, right?
Maybe also a little overwhelming. Welcome with us now into the vibrant, noisy, and absolutely foundational world of ancient Roman baths.
It's a world that was far more complex and central to Roman identity than just, hygiene. These structures were like microcosms of the entire society.
Microcosms, how so?
Well, they reveal these intricate details about their engineering prowess, their daily lives, social structures, and even their sort of evolving moral landscape.
Okay. And to help us really unpack this incredible phenomenon, we've got a fascinating stack of sources right here with us today. We've been diving into some really in-depth historical analyses, looking at detailed academic articles, examining the engineering and social aspects,
Hmm.
and even exploring a surprising look at how these spaces might connect to ancient texts you might not expect, like letters from the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, that connection is quite intriguing. It's a collection that allows us to move beyond just the simple image of like a public pool and see the baths as this dynamic, multi-layered institution that was absolutely critical to Roman civilization.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to fully unpack what Roman baths truly represented, moving far beyond just, the simple act of getting clean.
Right.
We're going to explore their absolutely critical and vibrant role as social and cultural centers, really central to city life. We'll marvel at the sheer scale and, frankly, the ingenuity of the engineering that allowed them to exist across the vast empire.
Incredible engineering.
We'll step inside these buildings to understand the daily experiences of Romans from pretty much every walk of life and delve into the complex social dynamics that unfolded within their walls,
Hmm.
including some really unique insights into how these spaces impacted women and also shifted views on public health.
It's a lot to cover, but honestly, every thread tells us something vital about Rome. Let's dive right in.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene with this daily ritual because the sources make it incredibly clear. Visiting the baths was not an occasional luxury. It was an absolutely essential, almost defining part of being Roman for a huge number of people.
Yeah, that's crucial.
It wasn't just something you did when you felt dirty. For many, it was a daily habit, as ingrained as, I don't know, going to work or eating.
That's a great way to put it. For most Romans, particularly men, the typical workday would wrap up relatively early, often around midday.
Midday,
Yeah.
that early.
Yeah, often. So from that point onward, usually from early afternoon until well into the evening, the baths would become a major destination. Our sources also note that women's visiting times could differ, sometimes limited to earlier in the day, particularly if there were separate facilities or specific hours designated for them.
Right.
Although, as we'll discuss, that wasn't always the case. Mixed bathing was definitely a thing later on.
And here is where it gets truly fascinating and frankly almost mind-boggling when you consider how rigidly structured Roman society was. The public baths were open and accessible to Romans from all societal classes.
All classes.
Imagine that the elite senator, the freeborn craftsman, the recently freed slave, even slaves themselves accompanying their masters, they could all be found in the same spaces, often literally rubbing shoulders.
This was profoundly unique. I mean, in a world defined by strict social hierarchies, where your status dictated pretty much everything where you lived, who you could dine with the baths offered this almost unparalleled opportunity.
Like a temporary equalizer.
Sort of, yeah. It was a rare arena where those barriers could, for a few hours at least, dissolve. You might see a client approaching their wealthy patron, not in a formal setting, like the morning salutatio, but while they were both, sweating it out or scraping oil off their bodies.
Huh. That changes the dynamic a bit.
Definitely. It was a place for networking, yes, but also just a place where people from vastly different backgrounds coexisted, observed each other, and maybe even interacted casually.
But as you mentioned earlier, cleanliness, while a benefit, wasn't the sole or maybe even the primary driver for everyone going there.
No, not at all.
Ugh.
The sources paint a picture of the baths as incredibly multifunctional hubs. People went there to unwind, absolutely, but also explicitly to socialize, to hang out with existing friends, sure, but just as importantly, to meet new people.
Right, the social networking aspect.
Exactly. Business deals were discussed and struck. Political conversations happened openly. People played board games in the courtyards, viewed impressive artwork that was often displayed within the complexes.
Wow, artwork too.
Oh yeah, often quite lavish. They exercised, received massages, read in dedicated rooms, listened to lectures or recitations, ate food, drank wine. And yes, the sources are quite clear. They were also places where various kinds of intimate encounters took place, both casual and commercial.
So really everything happened there.
It was, simply put, the beating heart of social and civic life in many Roman cities.
And you had options for your bathing experience, you mentioned.
Right. The sources differentiate between the two main types. First, there were the truly gargantuan, often imperial-funded public baths known as thermae. These were colossal complexes, monuments in themselves.
Like the famous ones in Rome.
Exactly, like the baths of Diocletian or Caracalla. The baths of Diocletian, for instance, could apparently accommodate up to 3,000 people at once.
3,000?
Yeah, and sprawled over an astonishing 30 acres, including gardens and surrounding facilities.
Yeah.
By the 4th century A.D., Rome wasn't just a city of baths. It was a city of thermae, boasting 11 of these immense structures.
11 massive bathing palaces. That's incredible.
It really is. But alongside these giants, there are also hundreds upon hundreds of smaller public or private baths called balnea.
Balnea. Okay.
Our sources tell us that by the 4th century A.D., Rome had no fewer than 856 of these smaller establishments. These might be privately owned but open to the public for a fee, or attached to private villas for personal use.
856, so almost one on every corner, practically.
Pretty much. And interestingly, even extremely wealthy Romans who possessed luxurious private baths within their own sprawling homes, they often still made the daily trek to the public thermae or balnea.
Why bother with the public ones if you had your own fancy private bath?
Exactly the point. The sources highlight that it was precisely for that vibrant, bustling social energy that private baths, however opulent, simply couldn't replicate.
Ah, so it's the people watching, the connections.
The scene. The public baths were where you saw and were seen, where the city truly came alive after the working day.
So whether you were a commoner visiting your local balneum or a senator at the imperial thermae, you were participating in this fundamental Roman experience that blended health, leisure, and social interaction.
Precisely. It was a daily necessity wrapped in entertainment.
Okay, stepping back from the daily ritual, let's talk about the buildings themselves, because you really cannot discuss Roman baths without talking about them as absolute engineering and architectural marvels.
Absolutely.
They weren't just functional boxes. They were often spectacular showcases of the most advanced design and building techniques available, explicitly reflecting the ambitions and power of their builders, often emperors themselves, using these projects to, well, gain popularity.
That's a crucial point. Our sources emphasize that baths were consistently among the most common and significant public buildings erected throughout the entire Roman Empire. In fact, they were frequently among the very first substantial structures Roman authorities would build after conquering and establishing control over a new area.
Really, like step one, build a bathhouse.
Almost. They served as a powerful, tangible symbol of Romanitas, a clear demonstration that Roman civilization, with its comfort, sophistication, and infrastructure, had arrived. It was a way of saying, we're here and we bring the good life.
And bringing that Roman civilization meant bringing water, a monumental amount of water. Explain the incredible systems they devised just to supply these complexes.
Well, the supply methods varied depending on the location and scale of the bath. Ideally, they might be built directly over natural hot springs, like the famous baths at the modern city of Bath in England.
Makes sense. Built-in hot water.
Exactly. They also utilized wells and large storage tanks within the city limits.
But for those colossal thermae you mentioned, springs and wells just wouldn't cut it, right?
Absolutely not. The sheer volume of water required for the huge pools, fountains, and constant flow demanded something far grander. This is where the extensive Roman aqueduct systems came into play.
Ah, the aqueducts, of course.
These were vital arteries, sometimes specifically built or significantly expanded just to supply a single, massive imperial bath complex. The aqueducts would channel water from distant springs or rivers into large reservoirs or cisterns, often located on high ground or built into the bath complex itself.
Where they'd store it up.
Right. These reservoirs would fill, sometimes overnight, ensuring a sufficient head of water pressure and a constant supply throughout the bathing day, even with thousands of people using it. It required incredible ingenuity to adapt these systems to diverse geographies.
Like mountains or deserts.
Exactly. Overcoming challenges like steep slopes, using siphons, or developing complex systems to capture rainwater or manage seasonal river levels, particularly in drier regions like North Africa. It was a massive feat.
So getting the water there was one miracle. Heating it, That was another entirely. The Roman warming methods were truly revolutionary for their time.
They were indeed. The core of the heating system relied on large furnaces. These were masonry structures, strategically located, usually beneath or immediately adjacent to the rooms they intended to heat.
Okay.
These furnaces burned constantly throughout the bathing day, fueled primarily by vast quantities of wood. Logistics for fuel must have been immense.
I bet. And from these furnaces came the famous hypocaust system, right?
Yes, the hypocaust. This was arguably Rome's most significant invention, specifically for internal heating, appearing around 100 BC or so, instead of just having like open fires or braziers in the rooms.
Which would be smoky.
Very smoky and inefficient. Instead, they created a raised floor. The floor was supported by pillars, stacks of brick, stone, or specially made terracotta discs called pili, leaving a substantial open space, often several feet high, beneath it.
Okay, like a crawl space.
Exactly. And hot air, smoke, and fumes from the furnaces were directed into this underfloor space.
So the entire floor became like a giant radiator.
Precisely. The stone or tile slabs forming the floor above absorbed the heat from the circulating air, becoming radiating surfaces themselves. They would get quite hot.
You mentioned needing special shoes?
Absolutely. So hot that bathers absolutely needed to wear special sandals with thick wooden soles, called sculponia, just to avoid burning their feet when walking around the warm areas.
Wow.
Over time, they refined the system further, directing the hot air and fumes not just under the floor, but also up through hollow spaces built into the walls. They used special hollow rectangular tiles called tubulae, stacked vertically to create flues within the wall structure.
Heating the walls, too, that creates a much more even, enveloping heat, I imagine.
Exactly. Heating the walls prevented condensation and created a much more comfortable warmth, sort of like a modern radiant heating system.
That's clever. And how did they heat the actual water for the pools?
For heating the water in the hot pools, they used large bronze or lead boilers positioned directly over the furnaces. These boilers were connected by a network of lead pipes to cold water tanks. By using valves, bath attendants could mix the hot water from the boilers with cold water to achieve the specific temperature required for different pools, like the hot caldarium or the warmer tepidarium pools.
So they could control the temperature pretty precisely.
Reasonably so, yes. For the hot pools themselves, sometimes they used a special bronze structure called a testudo, literally tortoise.
A tortoise.
Yeah, because of the shape, maybe.
Yeah.
It was placed in the pool, but had one side extending down directly over the furnace. This side would have absorbed intense heat and then transferred directly into the water it was in contact with, warming the pool water more effectively than just relying on the floor heat.
Incredible complexity. And they weren't afraid to use natural energy sources either, were they?
Not at all. A simple but very effective architectural choice was orienting the heated rooms, particularly the caldarium, to face south or southwest.
To catch the afternoon sun.
Exactly. This maximized exposure to the sun during the hottest parts of the day, allowing natural sunlight to contribute significantly to the heating. They also increasingly used glass windows, which became more common, to let in light and warmth while keeping the heat in. Some sources even speculate about using polished bronze mirrors or other reflective surfaces to bounce sunlight deeper into the rooms, though that's less certain.
So this combination of aqueducts, furnaces, the hypocaust system, heating floors and walls, boiler systems, and smart use of sunlight created these incredibly comfortable, warm, and well-supplied spaces.
Absolutely. And they were also, as you hinted, laboratories for architectural innovation.
How so?
Our sources point out that because bath complexes were often large, well-funded public projects, but perhaps didn't carry the same rigid traditional forms as, say, a temple, Roman architects felt freer to experiment.
Ah, less constrained by tradition.
Right. Features like large span vaulted ceilings and domes, which the Romans became famous for, were often first successfully attempted and perfected within the thermal baths before being applied to grander monuments like the Pantheon. They were pushing the boundaries of what was structurally possible with concrete and masonry.
That's a key insight. The baths weren't just using existing technology, they were actually driving innovation.
Precisely. They were proving grounds for architectural ambition.
Okay, let's step inside now and walk through the experience, because the layout usually followed a general sequence, didn't it? And the atmosphere was, well, unlike anywhere else. Guide us through a typical visit.
Okay, so your journey would typically begin in the apoditarium.
Apoditarium, got it.
This is the changing room, usually located right by the entrance. Here, you'd strip down completely.
Completely.
Usually, yes, and you'd place your clothing and belongings into niches or cubbies set into the walls.
And I imagine you needed to be pretty careful with your possessions,
Uh,
leaving stuff in an open cubby.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Theft was a known risk in the baths. Wealthier Romans would almost always bring a slave specifically to guard their clothing and valuables.
Right.
Others might pay a small fee to a bath attendant, a capsarius, to keep an eye on things. But yeah, sources still mention people getting robbed. It was a busy, crowded place.
Okay, so after changing, where might you go next? Into the heat.
Not usually straight away. Many would head to the palaestra.
Palaestra.
This was an outdoor courtyard or exercise area, often surrounded by a colonnade, kind of like a modern gymnasium courtyard.
Ah, okay. Get a workout in first.
Yeah, people would engage in physical activities, not usually super strenuous maybe, but enough to work up a light sweat and prepare the body for the heat. Activities included things like boxing, disc throwing, weightlifting, wrestling, and various ball games.
Yeah.
Some sources describe the palaestra as almost a separate concession within the complex, with its own entry and atmosphere.
Interesting. Then the actual sequence of bathing rooms, how did that usually work?
Yes, the standard practice was often to move through progressively warmer rooms. You might start in the tepidarium.
Tepidarium sounds like tepid.
Exactly. This was the warm room, heated by the hypocaust, but not intensely hot like the next stage. It served as a transitional space, allowing your body to acclimatize to the heat. Some tepidaria had warm baths or pools, but others, according to some sources, were simply warm, dry rooms used for resting or maybe for beginning the cleaning ritual by applying oil, a place to hang out.
Okay, so acclimatize, maybe socialize a bit. Then from warm to hot, the caldarium.
Exactly. The caldarium was the hot room. This was the most intensely heated space, often located directly above or near the main furnaces, and extensively using the hypocaust and those wall flues, the cubuli.
So properly hot and steamy?
Usually quite humid and steamy, yes. And it typically contained a large hot bath or pool, or perhaps individual tubs. Some caldaria also had a labrum, which was a small basin of cold water you could use to splash on yourself for a quick cool-down contrast while still in the hot room.
Ooh, that sounds refreshing in the heat. After enduring the heat, you'd eventually need to cool off properly, I assume.
Definitely. That's where the frigidarium came in.
Frigidarium cold room.
Right. This is the cold room, usually the final stop in the bathing sequence proper. It contained a cold plunge pool, sometimes quite large, and taking a dip here provided a refreshing shock after the heat of the caldarium or maybe another sweat room really closed the pores, supposedly.
Bracing. Were there other specialized rooms you might find?
Oh, yes, definitely, especially in the larger complexes, the thermae. There might be a natatio.
Natatio.
Yeah, an unheated swimming pool, often quite large and open air, more for actual swimming laps than just plunging. There could be a laconicum, which was a dry, intensely hot sweat bath, more like a modern sauna, or a sudatorium, which was a humid sweat bath.
So different kinds of heat experiences.
Exactly. And there was also often an unctorium, a room dedicated specifically to massage and anointing the body with oils after bathing.
Right, getting oiled up.
Part of the process for many.
And while this sequence you described, cool entry, exercise, warm, hot, cold, sounds logical, it wasn't always rigid, was it? Did everyone follow that exact path?
No, probably not rigidly, and especially in smaller baths. The layouts could vary significantly, while the large imperial thermae often featured incredibly balanced, symmetrical designs.
Why symmetrical? Just aesthetics?
Partly aesthetics, but also very practical. It was efficient for managing large crowds, directing flow, and it even allowed parts of the bath to be closed for maintenance or heating without disrupting the entire complex. You can maybe shut down one whole mirrored wing. But smaller balnea could have more irregular or asymmetrical layouts, dictated by the available space, the shape of the plot of land, or the specific preferences of the builder. Examples from Pompeii and Herculaneum show a really wide range of designs.
So you've got the space, the heat, the water. Let's talk about the core cleaning practice itself. How did Romans actually wash in the baths? You mentioned it wasn't with soap as we know it.
No, the primary method involved oil and a tool called a strigil.
Oil and a scraper, how did that work?
Romans would apply oil to their skin, typically olive oil, though maybe perfumed oils for the wealthy, either before entering the heated rooms or maybe after exercising in the palaestra. This oil was believed to help loosen dirt, absorb impurities from the skin, and also promote sweating.
Okay, so you get all oiled up.
And then the scraping. After sweating, or perhaps just before entering the cold plunge, bathers would use a strigil, which was this curved metal tool, usually made of bronze or sometimes iron, to scrape the oil, sweat, and accumulated grime off their skin.
Like squeegeeing yourself.
Kind of, yeah. This scraping action was the Roman equivalent of washing with soap and water. It removed the layer of oil, which had hopefully trapped the dirt. You could do it yourself, or have a slave do it, or pay a bath attendant for the service.
Sounds vigorous.
It probably was. You see depictions of athletes being striggled.
Now, let's bring the atmosphere to life a bit more. The sources give us this incredible sense of what it was like to actually be inside. What did it feel, sound, and look like?
Well, stepping into a busy Roman bath, especially a large one, was definitely an assault on the senses,
Yeah.
particularly sound. Seneca the Younger, the philosopher.
Oh, yes, you mentioned him. He lived above one.
Apparently so, or nearby. And he famously complained about the sheer cacophony he heard while trying to write. His description is incredibly vivid and paints a picture of just relentless noise.
What kinds of noises did he list? Sounds like he made quite a list.
He did. He lists it all. The sounds of straining weightlifters grunting and groaning in the palaestra, the rhythmic thud, or maybe slap, of masseuses pummeling bodies, scorekeepers shouting out the results of ball games, the loud splash of swimmers hitting the water, people singing loudly, maybe off-key.
Huh. Always someone singing in the shower or bath.
Apparently. And just the general hubbub of conversations, shouting, laughter. He specifically mentions the cries of vendors hawking their wares, calling out to sell sausage, bread, pastries, drinks.
Food vendors inside the bath
Like
complex?
little snack bars or mobile cellars. And there's one very specific, rather painful-sounding noise he highlights that always sticks with me.
What's that?
Ah, yes, the sound of the armpit hair plucker. The elliptical at work and the unavoidable high-pitched screams of their customers.
Ouch. Tweezing armpit hair in public.
Seems so. So it was clearly not always a quiet, serene spa experience we might imagine today. It was loud, active, crowded, and full of life.
Beyond the incredible noise, what about the visual environment? Was it just functional or?
Oh, in the more luxurious imperial baths, the visual spectacle would have been absolutely astonishing. The builders, often emperors, invested heavily in decoration. Our sources describe floors adorned with intricate marble mosaics, depicting myths, sea creatures, geometric patterns.
Wow.
Walls covered in vibrant frescoes and elaborate stucco panels, often depicting pastoral scenes, mythological figures, architectural fantasies. Domes might be painted with celestial imagery, like stars against a blue sky.
Like looking up at heaven.
Maybe. Statuary, often copies of famous Greek works, would be placed strategically throughout the complex. And fountains, big and small, would add the cooling sound in sight of flowing water. Compared to earlier, simpler Republican-era baths, like the Stabian baths in Pompeii, which were darker and much less adorned, the great imperial baths were designed to be truly opulent, stimulating environments, a feast for the eyes.
So it was about exercise and cleaning, yes, but also very much about spending time in a beautiful, engaging, almost entertaining space.
Exactly. It was a leisure destination in the fullest sense. And within this environment, you had all those extra amenities and services available. Beyond the food and drink vendors that Seneca mentions, you could pay for professional massages. Perfume sellers were common too. And yes, personal grooming was available, including that hair removal, often done with tweezers or sometimes waxes or pastes, which sounds unpleasant, but was clearly a service in demand for both men and women.
And for the really massive complexes, the thermae, the offerings, extended even further beyond just the core bathing areas, didn't they?
They truly functioned as comprehensive cultural and leisure centers. Larger thermae might incorporate libraries or reading rooms, with scrolls available.
Libraries in a bathhouse?
Yes. Imagine reading Plato after your plunge. There could be small stages or specific areas, exedrae for impromptu theatrical performances, poetry readings, or musical recitals. Some complexes even had adjacent stadia for more formal athletic competitions. It just underscores the point that these were comprehensive facilities designed to cater to a wide range of activities far beyond just getting clean.
It really paints a picture of a place that was absolutely central to urban life. Let's delve deeper now into the social tapestry woven within the baths, particularly how they functioned across class lines, and the very specific and often complex experiences of women there.
Okay. As we discussed briefly, that unique class interaction was one of the defining features. The baths offered this space where, for a few hours anyway, the strict social hierarchy of Rome became somewhat permeable.
Right. The senator and the craftsman potentially rubbing shoulders.
Exactly. People from different strata mingled. A client could approach their patron in a more relaxed, less formal setting than the morning salutatio at the patron's house. It provided opportunities for social mobility, networking, maybe overhearing gossip or business tips, or simply observing the customs and behaviors of different classes. It was a genuinely different dynamic than almost anywhere else in Roman public life.
Now, focusing specifically on women's experiences, our sources here are fascinating, but you also acknowledged a limitation. Much of Roman history, especially the written accounts we have, tends to focus on the lives and activities of prominent men.
That's very true. So, our understanding of the average Roman woman's interaction with the baths is often built upon more limited references, maybe inscriptions, and archaeological evidence, rather than detailed narratives from their perspective. However, the sources that do exist are quite revealing.
And we have to remember the context. Roman society placed an incredibly high value on female modesty and chastity, particularly for women of the upper classes. This was reinforced by laws like the Augustan laws implemented under Emperor Augustus, which aimed to regulate public and private morality.
This societal context is absolutely essential to understand, because according to some of the analyses we looked at, the baths emerged as one of the very few locations where women might have been able to temporarily step outside these heavily enforced, pre-established social norms around modesty, behavior, and even sexuality.
And the literary and archaeological examples you found here are incredibly striking, aren't they?
They really are. Take the Roman poet Martial. We mentioned him complaining about things, but he also observed social life keenly. In one of his epigrams, he writes about a woman bathing with the public. He then poses this rather provocative question, asking essentially why she would choose to do this if she didn't want her slave to see her untie a fibula.
A fibula. That's like a brooch or pin for clothing.
Exactly. A clasp or pin. In this context, it could imply fastening clothing, maybe a wrap worn for modesty, or perhaps even something more intimate. Marshall's question suggests a situation involving public undress or exposure in the baths that was clearly noteworthy, maybe even a bit scandalous, prompting him to question her motives if she genuinely valued her slave's discretion regarding her body. It hints at a different standard of exposure inside the baths.
That single line gives us a real window into a different standard applying within the baths, potentially.
It certainly suggests it. And then there's the extremely powerful, though admittedly controversial, archaeological evidence from Pompeii.
Ah, the fresco.
Yes, the fresco found in the apoditarium, the changing room, remember the suburban bathhouse. It depicts several quite explicit sexual acts. One particular image shows a man performing cunnilingus on a woman.
Wow. Okay, that's explicit.
Very. And our sources interpret this specific depiction as a prime example of how the baths were spaces where traditional social norms, particularly regarding sexuality and the expected behavior for men and women, could be fundamentally challenged or even broken.
How does that specific image represent a breaking of norms in the Roman context? It seems shocking by any standard.
Well, the sources highlight that for a Roman man, especially one potentially of some standing, to be depicted in such an act, particularly in what could be seen as a sexually subservient position to a woman, was highly unconventional and traditionally considered deviant behavior within Roman societal expectations. Prominent men were generally expected to be portrayed as sexually dominant. This image flips that dynamic.
So the baths were not just spaces for social fluidity regarding class, but also potentially places for challenging traditional gender roles and sexual norms.
Precisely. The sources explicitly state that Roman bathhouses often had these deep sexual undertones, with maybe less restriction regarding nudity and interaction than elsewhere. They suggest that the rigid Augustan laws aimed at controlling female sexuality seem to be almost bypassed, or perhaps conveniently shrouded, within the steamy confines of the bathhouses.
So it became a location where both men and women might have felt a greater sense of liberation from some of the strictest societal constraints imposed upon them outside those walls.
That's the argument put forward, yes. A space of temporary freedom, perhaps?
This naturally brings us to the topic of mixed bathing, men and women actually bathing together, and the whole practice of nudity. How common was that?
This is an area that seems to have evolved over time. In the earlier Republican period, baths often had separate facilities for men and women, maybe completely different sections of the complex, or designated separate hours for men and women to use the same facility. Seems more common then.
Okay, so separation was the original idea.
Often, yes. However, by the 1st century AD, especially into the imperial period, mixed bathing became quite common, particularly maybe in the smaller public balnea, and it's frequently remarked upon, sometimes critically, sometimes just noted by ancient writers like Martial, Juvenal, Pliny the Younger, and Quintilian.
So the writers were definitely aware of it. There's a mention that Emperor Hadrian might have tried to put a stop to this.
Yes, some historical evidence suggests Hadrian, perhaps around 130 AD, attempted to reinstate stricter gender separation in the baths, possibly due to concerns about morality or decorum. However, it doesn't seem to have been universally effective or particularly long-lasting, as accounts and mentions of mixed bathing continue well after his reign. The practice clearly persisted.
And regarding attire, or lack thereof, you said nudity was the norm.
The sources overwhelmingly indicate that visitors to the baths were typically completely nude.
And nudity would have further reinforced that temporary blurring of class lines we discussed earlier, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. In a society where clothing was such a powerful and immediate indicator of social status, wealth, and rank, being fully nude removed those visible markers. Everyone was reduced, visually at least, to their physical form. It definitely contributed to that unique, though perhaps temporary, sense of social leveling that occurred within the baths.
Is there any debate about that? Was everyone always nude?
There is some ongoing debate among modern scholars about whether any form of minimal bathing attire, maybe a loincloth, sublegaculum, or a wrap, was ever used regularly, perhaps by some women for modesty or in certain periods or types of baths. But the dominant evidence from ancient texts and numerous artistic depictions points towards widespread nudity being the general custom. The only common attire seems to have been those wooden-soled sculponia to protect feet from the hot floors.
Okay. Given this combination of factors, then the mixing of all classes, the definite sexual undertones we discussed, the widespread nudity, the common practice of mixed bathing, it's completely understandable that the baths became a target for moral criticism from some quarters of Roman society.
Undoubtedly. To many conservative Roman moralists, the baths, particularly these elements we've just discussed, represented a perceived decline in traditional Roman values: virtus, discipline, modesty. They saw it as a place of softness, excessive luxury, and potential moral decay.
You mentioned Cato the Elder attacking Scipio Africanus way back.
Yes, centuries earlier, Cato, the champion of old-school Roman austerity, publicly attacked Scipio Africanus, a great military hero, partly for his frequent use of bathhouses. Cato viewed it perhaps as effeminate or indicative of a lack of traditional Roman toughness and seriousness. The later moralists, writers like Seneca or Juvenal, echoed these sentiments, seeing mixed bathing as particularly egregious and a sign of societal corruption.
And there's a famous epitaph you found that perfectly encapsulates this tension, the sort of push and pull between the moral criticism and the undeniable appeal of the bath.
Yes, it's really striking. It's the epitaph of a man named Tiberius Claudius Secundus, dating probably to the 1st century A.D. It's very concise and incredibly revealing. It reads, Balnea Venus corrupt corpora nostra, set vitam fac balnea vina Venus.
Okay, break that down for us.
It translates roughly as, baths, wine, and sex corrupt our bodies, but baths, wine, and sex make life worth living.
Wow. That's blunt.
Isn't it? It's a remarkable statement. It openly acknowledges the very things the moralists criticized, the strong connection of baths to sensual pleasure alongside wine and sex, Venus, and admits the potential physical or moral decay they could cause, corrupt our bodies. But then it immediately counters that by asserting that these very things are what make life worthwhile. Vitam faciunt, they make life.
So it's like, yeah, that might be bad for us, but we love it anyway.
Pretty much. It perfectly captures the reputation of the baths, simultaneously viewed by some as potentially corrupting, but experienced by many as absolutely essential to a life fully lived, embracing pleasure.
Shifting gears slightly, let's place the baths within the larger framework of Roman public health. Our sources connect them deeply to Rome's extensive infrastructure projects.
They were absolutely integral to it. The baths were a key part of Rome's broader public health infrastructure, standing alongside their truly incredible achievements in building aqueducts to bring volumes of clean water into cities and sophisticated sewer systems, like the famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome, to take waste away.
Right. The aqueducts and sewers are famous.
And the baths were part of that package. Public health and sanitation were recognized by the Romans as fundamental pillars of civilization, absolutely essential for managing large, densely populated cities and maintaining a strong, healthy citizenry and, importantly, army.
It seems like such a natural fit. Baths are a place for cleaning, therefore they must be a public health measure. But as you hinted at earlier, the baths themselves weren't always what we would consider, well, sanitary by modern standards, were they?
This is the fascinating paradox, isn't it? While their purpose was partly sanitation and hygiene, the practical realities presented significant hygiene challenges. The water, often drawn from public aqueducts, could itself be susceptible to contamination before it even reached the baths, especially after heavy rains which might wash debris or pollutants into the open channels.
Okay, so the source water wasn't always perfect.
And then the fact that so many people, potentially hundreds or thousands a day, were bathing together in the same water meant that the pools could quickly accumulate oil, sweat, dirt, and who knows what else from all those bodies over the course of a bathing day.
Ew. And ancient Romans weren't totally oblivious to this, were they? They must have noticed the water getting murky.
No, they certainly noticed. We have that quote from Marcus Aurelius, the emperor and Stoic philosopher. In his Meditations, he offers a rather visceral description of the baths, complaining about the oil, sweat, dirt, filthy water, all things disgusting that one encountered there.
So even an emperor noticed it was pretty gross sometimes.
Clearly. So they were keenly aware the water wasn't always pristine.
And even without a modern understanding of germ theory, they seem to understand that dirty water could be unhealthy, right?
Exactly. Medical texts from the period, such as those by the physician Celsus, warned specifically against bathing with fresh wounds due to the risk of infection, which they called gangrene. While they didn't know why the water was dangerous in that context, they didn't know about bacteria, they observed the negative outcome.
So don't go in with an open cut.
Good advice even then.
Yeah.
And allowing individuals who were visibly sick to bathe, which undoubtedly happened given the open access policy, likely contributed to the spread of various skin conditions or other ailments within the communal pools.
And keeping these huge volumes of water clean must have been incredibly difficult without modern chemicals like chlorine or filtration systems.
It was a massive challenge. The only way to truly clean the pools was to completely drain the vast amounts of water, scrub the basin, and then refill them. How often this was actually done is unclear from historical records, and it likely varied widely depending on the bath's management and resources.
Probably not daily for the big pools.
Almost certainly not daily for the huge pools. It seems plausible the water was probably only changed when it became visibly very cloudy or dirty, which, as you can imagine, would have already made it quite unappealing and potentially unsanitary for users long before that point. For smaller pools or basins, maybe it was more frequent, but for the large natatio or caldarium pools, it would have been a major undertaking involving time and water resources.
So you have this real tension, a key public health infrastructure designed in part for sanitation, but also potentially a breeding ground for hygiene issues and maybe even disease spread.
It highlights the Roman approach, this very public, communal combination of socializing and personal cleaning. One source even muses on this, suggesting that perhaps modern public health advocates could learn something from this Roman model.
Learn what? To build more bathhouses.
Maybe not exactly. But the idea is that Romans successfully integrated an act of sanitation, cleaning oneself, into a highly desirable social activity that people wanted to do every day. Could modern health measures, the source asks, be somehow rebranded or combined with social activities to encourage compliance?
Like making vaccinations a social event or...
Something like that. For instance, during a pandemic, maybe combining necessary measures like mask wearing or testing with positive social incentives or virtual communal events, drawing a parallel to how Romans cleverly linked getting clean with going to a fun, engaging social hub. It's about framing.
Interesting thought. The sources also make a brief, intriguing connection to how Romans thought about disease outbreaks and a concept we understand much better now: zoonotic diseases.
Yes, it's noted almost in passing in one source that even in ancient times, Romans speculated about a link between contact with animals and the outbreak of infectious diseases. While their understanding was obviously limited, this intuition is confirmed by modern science. We now know that over 60% of infectious disease outbreaks today are zoonotic.
Meaning they jump from animals to humans.
Exactly. Caused by pathogens that spread from animals, wild or domestic, to humans. The source briefly mentions historical examples like rabies, or maybe even precursors to things like the Black Death, though that came later, which are known zoonotic events. It suggests this ancient Roman observation about an animal connection had some basis in reality, even if they lacked the scientific framework to explain it.
And looking back at Rome's overall experience with public health, including the baths, what enduring lessons do our sources suggest for contemporary society?
Well, the primary lesson highlighted, particularly in the source focused on public health, is the fundamental importance of states investing heavily and consistently in public health infrastructure and policy. It's not just a nice-to-have, a core necessity. The source draws a parallel between Rome's incredible ascent from a minor kingdom to a vast, thriving empire and the parallel improvements it made in public health policies and infrastructure, like the baths, aqueducts, sewers. Good public health-supported growth.
And the reverse is also true.
Yes, conversely, it points to events like the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century AD. This was a large-scale epidemic, possibly smallpox or measles, that killed millions across the empire, severely weakened the army, disrupted the economy, and is seen by many historians as a significant contributing factor to the empire's later stresses and eventual decline.
So public health crises can genuinely impact the fate of empires or nations today.
Absolutely. The source explicitly uses the recent global COVID-19 pandemic as a contemporary example, reinforcing the idea that modern states must invest proactively in pandemic preparedness, cultivate expertise by creating stable employment for public health specialists, not just relying on them in crises, and, drawing back to the baths again, find innovative ways to encourage public compliance with necessary health measures.
Maybe by making them more appealing, less burdensome.
Perhaps successfully linking them to desirable social activities or making public health initiatives feel like a positive community effort, not just a restriction, echoing how Romans, for better or worse, made sanitation an integral part of amusement and daily social life in the baths.
As we start to wrap up this really fascinating deep dive, let's consider the lasting legacy of Roman baths. They weren't just buildings that eventually crumbled, were they? They left a bigger mark.
Not at all. They left a profound impact, culturally and architecturally. The sources underscore how the baths were viewed throughout the empire as a hallmark of civilized culture, a tangible symbol of Roman identity and sophistication. They helped spread Roman culture and lifestyle wherever legions and administrators went. They became a daily necessity that reinforced Roman identity and a commitment to health and well-being, at least as the Romans understood it.
And architecturally, you've already touched on how they were innovation hubs.
Yes, and it really bears repeating. The baths served as essential proving grounds for Roman architects and engineers. The demands of spanning large spaces for the halls and pools, combined with often generous imperial funding and that relative freedom of design we talked about, meant that innovative structures like large span-vaulted ceilings using concrete and, crucially, domes were experimented with and perfected in bathhouses before being employed confidently in other monumental buildings like temples or basilicas, most famously the Pantheon.
So bathhouses helped pave the way for the Pantheon's dome.
In a way, yes. They were engines of architectural advancement.
Finally, let's revisit that really surprising potential connection you mentioned earlier to ancient texts, specifically the letters of the Apostle Paul. How might bathhouses connect there?
This is a fascinating line of exploration from one of our sources, looking at cultural context. Paul was writing his letters to Christian communities in major Roman cities like Ephesus, Corinth, and of course Rome itself, cities that were absolutely dominated by large Roman bath complexes. These were places his audience would have known intimately, visited regularly, perhaps even daily.
Okay, so the audience knew baths well, and the connection is in his language, metaphors.
Exactly. The source points out that Paul frequently uses powerful metaphors related to clothing and the act of changing identity, which might resonate deeply with the physical daily ritual of going to the baths. In letters like Ephesians, Romans, and Colossians, Paul speaks about profound spiritual or moral transformation, using the imagery of rid yourselves of the old self, or take off the old man and put on the new self, or clothe yourselves with the new man.
Taking off the old, putting on the new.
Right, and the specific Greek words he employs for rid yourselves, or take off, apotithemi, and put on, enduo, are the standard everyday words used for taking off and putting on clothing.
Just like changing in the apoditarium, the changing room.
Precisely. The apoditarium, the changing room of the bathhouse, was the primary public space where people performed this very act, stripping off their daily clothes, representing their old self outside the bath, and then later putting their street clothes back on, putting on their public persona again. The Greek word for the changing room itself, apoditarion, comes from a root verb, apodou, meaning specifically to remove clothing or to strip oneself. So when Paul talks about stripping off the old self, the image of the apoditarium might immediately spring to mind for his urban Roman audience. It's a powerful daily image.
That makes sense. And there's an even stronger version of this metaphor he uses sometimes.
Yes, in Colossians, Paul uses an even more intense verb, apektomai. It's translated as stripped off or divested when describing the act of shedding the old sinful self in conversion. The source highlights that Paul uses this same powerful word elsewhere in Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, to describe Jesus' victory over spiritual rulers and authorities, saying that Christ stripped them or disarmed them in his triumph.
Stripped them in his triumph, like a Roman triumph parade.
Exactly. The word apektuai was used specifically by some writers to describe the brutal, humiliating act in a Roman triumph celebration where a defeated enemy leader was publicly stripped of their clothes, armor, and symbols of rank, as a symbol of their absolute defeat and loss of power, often before being executed.
Wow, so the metaphor potentially connects the mundane act of changing clothes in the bathhouse changing room to the violent stripping of a conquered enemy general.
That's the suggestion. The source proposes that for an audience living in major Roman cities, deeply familiar with both the daily ritual of the apoditarium and the incredibly powerful political and military symbolism of the Roman triumph, even if they hadn't personally witnessed one, these phrases about stripping off would have been incredibly vivid and potent. Paul is perhaps leveraging these familiar cultural images, the daily stripping off of clothes in the bath, and the dramatic stripping of power in a triumph, to convey the truly radical, total, transformative nature of shedding one's old identity and putting on a completely new one in Christ.
It's speculative, of course, but
It's speculative, yes, linking language to cultural practice, but it offers a fascinating insight into how deeply integrated the baths were into the Roman consciousness, and how that might be reflected even in the religious language of the time.
that really adds a whole new layer to understanding those ancient texts, thinking about the listeners' daily lives.
It does. It just shows how pervasive the culture of the baths was, touching potentially everything.
So, to try and recap this incredible deep dive, Roman baths were anything but simple places to wash. They were complex, social, cultural, engineering, and maybe even metaphorical hubs, absolutely vital to daily life for Romans from pretty much every level of society.
Absolutely central.
They offered this extraordinary blend of activities, from physical exercise and intellectual pursuits to business deals and, well, unrestrained social and sometimes sexual interaction, all facilitated by truly ingenious engineering.
Despite facing significant challenges with hygiene.
Right, despite the hygiene issues and drawing sharp criticisms from moralists about the mixed bathing and perceived decadence, they were powerful symbols of Roman identity, crucial testing grounds for architectural innovation, and potentially even provided vivid imagery for ancient literature and religious thought.
They were truly remarkable, multifaceted institutions that tell us an immense amount about the Roman world's priorities, anxieties, and complexities.
Which leaves us with this to ponder, maybe. When we look at the Roman bath, a place that combined sophisticated public health infrastructure like aqueducts with undeniable hygiene challenges within its pools, a space that blurred the lines between leisure, essential sanitation, vibrant social interaction, and explicit sexual activity, and uniquely offered broad accessibility across a highly stratified society. What does this paradoxically clean, yet dirty, moralistically criticized, yet universally loved space ultimately reveal about the true priorities and contradictions inherent in ancient Roman society?
And perhaps more pointedly,
Yeah, how much has truly changed in our own contemporary relationship with public spaces dedicated to health, leisure, and social connection today? Are our gyms, pools, spas, community centers really so different in the social functions they serve or the tensions they reveal?
a question that might make you think twice next time you hit the local swimming pool or gym changing room.
Indeed, it might. A lot to think about there.